Hello, I'm Dr. Parme Giuntini from Otis College of Art and Design. Today we're going to be talking about photography, one of the most interesting inventions of the 19th century. Photography changed the way that people thought about the notion of reality. Were photographs truthful, even if they were staged? Does the camera lie? What was the relationship between photography and fine art? Could photography even be fine art? These are just a few of the questions that people had in the 19th century. Let's start by looking at the way that photography made such a difference in the modern world.
Photography was another crucial influence on the development of modern art and a modern approach to representation. Photography dramatically altered the way that people, not just artists, thought about representation, about notions of truth and beauty and reality. Some people believed that photography would liberate painting from the necessity of imitation because it could take over many of the more commercial aspects of painting. Because photography almost immediately had a commercial application in modern society, there would be a long-standing tension among photographers over what constituted fine art photography, what kinds of practices or techniques would be acceptable in a fine art photograph. Like most technology, photography developed rapidly in a highly competitive atmosphere with contributions from British and French and American inventors. So photography must be seen as one of the modern technological improvements like steam power or gas lighting. This photograph from 1826, called View from His Window, was made by Joseph Nipsey. It's called a heliograph, and he made it by using sunlight on a chemically treated surface. The picture is somewhat fuzzy, and the process took a very long time, about 8 hours. But it resulted in a permanent image, and that was a technological breakthrough. About a decade later, Louis Daguerre figured out how to make another kind of chemically produced image that showed greater detail and clarity, which he called a daguerreotype. This 1837 still life, titled The Artist's Studio, is an example of this work. Daguerre believed that photography would upset all scientific theories on light and optics and revolutionize the art of drawing. These first advances were complicated procedures, and it was not until the 1840s that an Englishman, William Talbot, succeeded in developing the first true negative-positive photographic process that is the basis of modern photography. And that is what you are looking at in this example called the Open Door from 1843. It's not critical that you know all the technological intricacies of photography's development, but it is important that you understand the impact that this invention, this new form of technology, had on artists and on the public, on professionals and on amateurs, for both commercial use as well as in fine art. It was a fascinating new technology with enormous potential for application far beyond professional use, and it kept getting easier and easier. As early as 1888, the American inventor and avid photographer Eastman Kodak had already coined the phrase, "You press the button, we do the rest," to advertise his new Kodak camera. These cameras came preloaded with enough film for 100 exposures. When they were finished, the entire camera could be mailed back to the company where the film was developed and then shipped back to the customer. Eastman Kodak was interested in making cameras more affordable and easier to use. By 1900, he had developed what he called the Brownie Camera. It was small, it was portable, it was literally a one-button operation, and it was very, very cheap. This meant that amateurs now were part of the targeted audience, not just professional photographers. Easy to use and cheap. What more could a modern public ask of technology? This photograph of the author George Sand's. A woman who went by a man's name dates from the mid-1870s. This is typical of the kind of studio portrait that became popular with audiences in the late 19th century, initially in big cities like Paris and London, New York, and Chicago. This is where professional photographers could set up studios and be assured of enough customers to be financially successful. Technology had advanced rapidly, and by the 1870s, most photographers were using the Collodion process. This means they were using glass negatives with a fast exposure time that made positive prints on paper. These are not handheld cameras, and by our standards, there was still a lot of equipment and preparation necessary just to take the picture, much less develop it. However, like any other technology that was popular, people were making continual improvements. Studio photographers catered to middle-class patrons who were interested in this faster and cheaper way to document their lives. For most of these people, commissioning an oil portrait would have been far too expensive. Going to a photography studio to have a wedding or anniversary or family picture taken was very affordable. These are small pictures, but they offered an unprecedented opportunity to a public who wanted to document their lives and to remember how loved ones looked. Just think how often you use a digital camera or a smartphone to take photos, and how important they are to the way that you live and communicate with friends. It's not hard to understand why portrait photography became one of the most commercially successful applications. Because it was considerably cheaper than painting, it did ultimately undermine the portrait painting business, however. But then, it had always been just the wealthy who could really afford to commission an oil painting of themselves or of their families. Photographers adopted the conventions of portrait painters when they made these photographs, and you can see that in this photograph of the famous 19th century stage actress Sarah Bernhardt. The backgrounds were relatively blank, although some photographers did use stock backgrounds. Sitters took the same kinds of poses and stances, even the same gestures, that they would have if they were being painted. These often look somewhat stilted to us, but then these were the stylistic conventions for 19th century formal portraits, and they set the standards for what people expected in formal photographs. Avant-garde painters saw photography as an aid, a tool in their work, but not a challenge to painting. For painters interested in street scenes and landscapes, as well as portraiture, it's easy to see how they immediately used photography in terms of adaptation. The Impressionist painter Degas, who was well known for his paintings of ballerinas, also took photographs of them. The modern sculptor Rodin had photographs made of the model he used for his first important work, The Age of Bronze. Artists could use photographs as a memory aid of the model or the landscape they were working on while they were working in their studios. In some cases, photography dramatically changed what artists and audiences had long taken for truthful representation. My favorite example is that of Galloping Horses. From the late 18th century, horses and horse racing had been a popular genre topic, especially for the British, but later for Americans who were fascinated with westward expansion, cowboys, and Native Americans. It was a popular belief that galloping horses had all four legs off the ground at the same time, and that when this happened, their legs were outstretched. Artists painted galloping horses this way for well over a century, even though no one could prove it, and it was impossible to see with the naked eye. That's how the well-known American illustrator and artist Frederick Remington drew the galloping horse in Over the Foothills. However, the British photographer Edward Muybridge experimented with multiple cameras and stop-action photographs, and in 1877 he was able to prove that a galloping horse did have all four legs off the ground, but they were not outstretched. Instead, they were drawn up under the animal's belly. On the basis of this photographic proof, Remington and every other artist painting galloping horses changed their representation to one that was accurate and real, such as you see in this drawing of a crow scout. A camera, a machine, had generated authentic, indisputable proof. Initially, photography was considered a transparent medium, a process that exactly reproduced reality because it was made with the camera, and people thought of a camera as a machine. They didn't think of a photograph as a mediated or manipulated product the way that they understood a painting to be. They didn't think of the photographer as someone who manipulated the final image through cropping or under or overdeveloping. They believed that a photograph was an authentic document, that it showed the truth. Its imagined directness and lack of mediation were understood as characteristic of the mechanical process. Such a position is, of course, highly problematic, but the 19th century was fascinated with this rapidly improving technology. Small, black and white, often fuzzy and staged pictures hardly strike us as realistic, but audiences considered them more authentic representations of the subject because they were made with a machine, and they lacked the idealizing qualities associated with painting practices. By comparison, painting was understood as personally imaginative, expressively filtered, and highly constructed. Painting was seen as a process that was often reliant on preparatory drawings, on literary themes, subject to change midway through, and especially to artistic interpretation. Photography just seemed the most authentic and efficient way to document reality and to be a true indicator of modernity. Documentation was a very important use for photography. Exotic and ordinary sights were equally popular. Everything from photographs of the Fontainebleau forest, yes, the same one that Corot had painted, to Lake Lucerne in Switzerland, to El Capitan in Yosemite. The U.S. government regularly sent photographers on expeditions to the West, where they took pictures of Native Americans, the Rocky Mountains, Lake Tahoe, and the newly developing railroads. What is important to remember is that learning how to operate a camera was considerably easier than learning how to draw or paint, and that photographs were understood to be more accurate records of people, places, and events than illustrations could have been. They were cheap, they were easy to reproduce, and they were in growing demand. Literally nothing could or would escape the camera lens. As travel expanded, as new fields like anthropology developed, as colonial empires grew, photographers documented these new places, new people, and new events. Nadar, who took that photograph of Sarah Bernhardt, also did this one of an unidentified West Indian woman. Bare-breasted and draped in native fabrics, he created an image of the exotic non-West for contemporary Parisians. And along with world fairs and international expositions, this is the way that Europeans learned about new cultures. Americans got their first significant exposure to photographic documentation in the Civil War photographs of Timothy O'Sullivan, Alexander Gardner, and Thomas Brady. During the Civil War, these photographers were attached to the Union Army, sort of a 19th century version of photographers and videographers embedded today with troops. They photographed a variety of wartime aspects. soldiers and officers outside their tents, artillery, preparations made for battle, and the aftermath of battles. They did not have the technology for action shots yet, so they could not take photographs of the soldiers actually in battle. They photographed the sick, the wounded, the dying, even Confederate prisoners. Although recorded in minute detail, these often look like stage shots, especially those on the battlefield, such as gathered for burial and Antietam. These were bodies of fallen soldiers that had been dragged from the battlefield and rearranged to achieve a more dramatic composition. The success of these photographs, many of which were published in bound volumes, led the way for documentary photography and demonstrated that there was a viable commercial market. It's important to remember that most of these photographs were seen after the war. During the war, coverage was supplied through magazines and newspapers who hired illustrators who were also attached to the Union Army. The 19th century painter Winslow Homer spent 2 years with the Union Army sending drawings like this Union sharpshooter, what we would call a sniper today, back to Harper's Weekly, which is one of the most popular and widely read magazines. Harper's published this illustration in 1862, and many more like it on a weekly basis. Because cameras were still bulky and unwieldy, it would have been impossible for photographers to take these kinds of pictures, so illustrators supplied the by-the-minute images. The notion of recording or documenting an event, a set of conditions or activities for historical and or reforming purposes, is the goal of documentary photography, and it developed rapidly in the late 19th century after the Civil War. It goes hand in hand with contemporary reforming tendencies across the nation, and as such, documentary photographs were often published in books with accompanying text. These photographs increasingly replaced on-the-spot sketches or illustrations, which the public was accustomed to. And as technology improved, photography would become an important part of journalism. It goes without saying that 19th century documentary photography was governed by a somewhat different set of rules than we would accept today, where the very notion of moving bodies to achieve a greater dramatic effect would immediately discredit the authenticity of the photograph. Be aware that as the idea of documentary photography develops, it does so along with the idea of social criticism and reform. Photographers often took liberties that we would not accept as willingly today, but they had good reason in the 19th century for doing that. By the 1880s, documentary photography had a champion in Jacob Riis. He produced both a visual and written account of immigrant life in New York's Lower East Side, published under the title, How the Other Half Lives. You were looking at one of the photographs from that edition, called 5 Cents a Spot, Unauthorized Lodgings from 1890s. Riis documented the harsh conditions under which new immigrants often had to live. In this photograph, he is showing you how people would pay 5 cents for a chance to sleep for 8 hours. They were too poor to afford their own apartments. His photographs graphically detailed these and other appalling conditions and social deprivation of the immigrant population that had flooded that part of New York. These were mostly Russian, German, Jewish, and Irish immigrants, and Riis often persuaded, threatened, and sometimes even bribed them to pose. He photographed a lot of immigrant families in their crowded quarters, like this 1889 photograph of a tenement interior. Like the Civil War photographers before him, he also composed many of his pictures for maximum emotional effect. The pictorial record that he made was the first public exposure of the degrading conditions under which these recently arrived immigrants lived. Documentary photography was early associated with the moral and radical vocabulary in which the photographer participated in a biased way. He was not a neutral party, but an active agent on behalf of the subject. The implicit assumption that the camera was a transparent medium allowed the power of these images to far surpass any other medium. They just would not have been effective had they been painted or drawn by an illustrator. Rice was effective in attracting a lot of public attention with the reality of his photographs, because, as Susan Sontag notes, the photograph is read against its contemporary context. Rich New Yorkers, and in the 19th century, they were the richest people in the United States, may have known about the slums of New York. In fact, they may have owned many of those slums, but they might not have been aware of how horrible the conditions were. Rice's photographs were intended to call attention to those kinds of issues. Because Rice published his photographs in book form with explanatory text, they circulated among the public in a much open and more accessible way than they would have if he had shown them in a fine art gallery or in some kind of an exhibition. Rice was followed by a string of reforming documentary photographers, and we could say that the string is unbroken, since documentary photography is alive and thriving today and has expanded to include video as well. In France, some of the most enthralling pictorial documents of the 19th century were done by Eugene Atget, who spent years wandering the city of Paris and taking photographs of a city that he loved, but one that was rapidly changing and becoming more modern every day. In this iconic image, the Ragpicker, from the very end of the 19th century, Atget immortalized the kind of personal commercial activity that was quickly disappearing from the city. He photographed a ragpicker dragging his cart, which is heaped with cast-off clothing, through a city street. These photographs were virtually unknown while Atget was alive, but at his death, hundreds of them were discovered, and they remain today one of the best and most accurate ways of knowing what Paris looked like in the late 19th century. Although French law defined photography as a mechanical process and not an art, by the 1860s, some photographers were regularly claiming to be fine artists. Although they were engaged in a business, they adopted the academic conventions for portrait painting and for history painting in order to make photographs. The French photographer Gustave Le Gray suggested that fine art photography should concentrate on expressive features, the modulation of light and shadow, tonality, and composition. He was interested in prioritizing the expressive effects because that is what would distinguish a fine art photograph from a more commercial photograph. This means that 19th century fine art photographers tended to use the same stories, gestures, poses, costumes, and conventions that portrait painters or history painters were using. And these photographers hoped that their photographs would generate the same kind of audience reaction. Let's look at an example to see what I mean. You're looking at a photograph of St. John the Baptist by Julia Margaret Cameron and a painting of the Virgin, the baby Jesus, and John the Baptist by William Bouguereau. Julia Margaret Cameron was an English photographer. William Bouguereau was a well-known French academic artist, and they were working at the same time. The conventions for depicting St. John the Baptist had been established for centuries. If Bouguereau were going to paint the saint as an adult, he would have shown him bearded, hairy, carrying a staff, and wearing animal skins. If he were going to show the saint as a little boy or a baby, he would have shown him naked or wearing an animal skin or holding a staff. You can see that he has chosen animal skins for his painting. In her photograph, Cameron used the same accepted convention. She posed a young naked boy with animal skins to distinguish the fact that he was St. John the Baptist. She used the same iconographical references that were already established for representing the saint. This is very typical of what fine art photographers did in the 19th century, especially when they wanted to photograph subjects that already had a parallel in painting. Julia Margaret Cameron often made photographs that had a highly moralizing message, and she often used children or women in these photographs. In part, this was because she was a woman and it was considered less appropriate for her to photograph men. You should take this as a comment on 19th century gender attitudes and not on her ability as a photographer. None of these concerns were an issue for male photographers. And in fact, male 19th century photographers did a very brisk business in female nudes, which was also a standard and accepted subject in fine art painting. They often used the same poses and props, such as you see in this 1854 photograph of a female nude by the painter Eugene Delacroix. However, photographs of nudes were much more realistic than paintings of them. Even though photographers like Nadar did their best to duplicate the established academic poses of the female nude, such as this 1858 photo of the model Marie Christine Roux, they could not create the sense of aesthetic distance that the audience was accustomed to experiencing when looking at a painting. The public knew that a photograph was a picture of an actual person, complete with body hair and specific physical attributes, and that it had been produced by a machine. It was truthful. It was authentic. It was real. Since these photographs were still considerably smaller than the scale of history painting, and that is where most female nudes appeared, there was also the worry that the photographs were intended for pornographic purposes, and that would challenge their status as fine art. In our contemporary world of internet access and much more liberal attitudes towards the body, these kinds of concerns might strike you as silly or groundless. However, in the 19th century world, standards for what was publicly acceptable in fine art were very different, and by the 1850s, France had clamped down on nude photographic academies, and the French Photographic Society banned nudes from its exhibitions. By the close of the 19th century, photography was an ingrained and critical part of modern life. There were still concerns over the different kinds of photographs, the categories that should be established, the argument that fine art photography should operate a higher status than documentary or commercial photography. These are all issues that spilled into the 20th century and that we will be talking about later. One critical factor remains. Photography changed the way that people thought about representation, about truth, and about art.
You can see that by the end of the 19th century, it was very clear that the camera was an important part of professional artistic practice, political and social documentation, and well on its way to being easy and affordable for ordinary people. When we get to the 20th century, we'll revisit photography and the concerns that professional photographers had over its status as fine art, as well as the many other ways photography continued to frame and reflect modern ideas. In our next lecture, we're going to look at the second half of realism, and in particular at the extraordinary work and influence of Edouard Manet, whose works caused enormous anxiety in the 19th century, but are considered absolutely iconic today.